Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and we have finally come to the conclusion of our seven-part series on the seven-part lecture on the home front of the United States Civil War. Whew. Huh. And now to just dive into it and try to wrap this up. Um, in the Confederate States, the African Americans were still held as slaves, and they kept the economy functioning. As stated in earlier lectures, the Confederate States were able to mobilize such a high percentage of their male population because of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery allowed the economy to function as it normally would have. Thousands more were of slaves. Thousands more slaves were impressed into the Confederate war effort, performing attacks such as cooks, launderers, teamsters, all of the proper support roles necessary to make warfare possible. As the war progressed, the system of chattel slavery underwent a series of profound changes. Early in the war, Confederate civilians, they began to enact a series of precautions to guard against Nat Turner-like slave rebellions during the Civil War. The Confederate Home Guard routinely patrolled and arrested free African Americans and slaves suspected of conspiring to stage uprisings. There were also punctuated episodes of communal hysteria. Many thought that the United States would employ a John Brown-like plan and arm slaves to fight against them. This was compounded by the fact that most of the able-bodied men had left. 80% of the eligible white male community population had left. They did not really have the numbers to suppress the slaves or to really oversee the slaves as they had before. And they were really left with these large concentrations of slaves in a lot of the black belt counties. Now, with the exception of the United States arming former slaves to fight against them, all of these fears proved to be baseless. There were no major uprisings of slaves during the course of the United States Civil War. Nonetheless, there was a great sense of anxiety, particularly among slave owners, that their slaves were either planning on running away or conspiring to stage uprisings. Now, the reason why the slaves did not resort to staging any sort of insurrection was not because they were happy being kept as slaves. There were a number of reasons why they did not resort to more emphasis or large-scale emphasis of mass violence. One reason was that many did not live in areas penetrated by the United States Army until late in the war. New Orleans and Memphis are notable exceptions, but the core heartland of the Confederacy lay in South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. Without the United States Army being present, there really wasn't any place to run to. For those who had blood and extended family connections, there was a great desire to keep the family together. Many in the African American community thought that freedom was near, and the last thing you wanted to do was to go off by yourself and leave family behind. If freedom is coming, then let's all get freedom together. Let's do this as a community. Let's do this as a group. There was a deep desire, a deep sense of family among the African American community. This was something that the families were going through together. This wasn't just one person here, one person there. There was also a flurry of rumors going around within the Confederate civilian population and also within the slave community that centered on talks of the presence or the impending arrival of United States military personnel to specific locations. A number of slave community leaders opted to observe a wait and see policy as far as the arrival of United States military personnel came. And when United States military personnel did arrive, they attached the entire community they were a part of to that army. That gave rise to the whole phenomenon of the contraband slave and the contraband camps. There were also community fears about the intentions of the men commanding the armies in the United States, that the United States had sent to cut through the Confederate States. Everybody was well aware of what Banks had done. Nathan Banks had become infamous for basically bringing back slavery, even though they were supposed to be free. What Nathan Banks had done had given cause for African Americans to pause and to wait to see who these men were. Lastly, there were the draconian penalties still inflicted upon the entire community after rebellions and escapes. The Confederate Home Guard was still on hand and very active in areas with very large concentrations of slaves. Now, through all that, chattel slavery persisted and with no major uprising, but the institution nonetheless weakened during the course of the war for practical reasons. With so many slave masters and overseers away, control of everyday operations on the plantation passed to older slaves, slave men and slave women, who could exercise power and control with lesser strictness. They would be given an order by an older white male or an older white female or a younger white male, younger white female, and simply not do it. And there wasn't really any recourse to it. They could not corral them the way that the old slave patrols had done. Those slave patrols that were that regularly drilled, that were captained and officered by graduates of the many military academies in the South. Those who regularly exercised, went out there with the hounds and so forth and tracked things down. Those who went through the woods and learned how to track. They could not exercise the same amount of control. They could not inspire the same amount of caution in the behaviors of the slave population that stayed behind as the older ones had. You had a gradual weakening of everything, of all of their abilities on the plantation. In many instances, the slave master's wife or the slave master's elderly uncle or father or whoever gave over the chief duties of management and harvesting. They gave those over to slaves, and again the slaves employed more relaxed attitudes towards work and encounters with runaways. Many runaways were harbored on their way north on farms and plantations that had slave overseers or slave managers during the war, and there was nothing that the owners could do about it. There was nothing that they could do. The rules of the game had changed, and everybody was quickly adapting to it. This was a revolutionary shift in the relationship between slave and master. Slaves are refugees. Refugees who held slaves, they found it way more difficult to manage their slaves. Their relationship had fundamentally changed as well. The old order was broken. For them, the slave master could not in any way exert the same type of fear or control over his or her slaves during the relocation or resettlement process, even if the eventual destination was to another plantation owned by the slave master or to a property owned by relations of the slave master. The opportunity for escape was too great, especially if the United States military was near. Refugees hemorrhaged the slaves. The impressment of slaves into the Confederate war effort also weakened the practice of slaveholding. Slavery Slaves were usually taken to cities to labor in manufacturing wartime necessities. In the cities, it was always more difficult to monitor the actions of the slave than it was on the rural plantation. As vital necessities became scarcer and scarcer in the Confederate States, the authority of the slave masters diminished as well. All these events came together to erode the practice of chattel slavery. Um, However, the greatest change, the one that I alluded to earlier, was in the nature of the role of slavery in the Confederate States as a whole. Debates began to occur regarding enlisting slaves and freedmen into the Confederate Army. Manpower shortages made this a key concern, but the road was arduous to say the least. As early as 1861, freemen came up, having freemen serve came out, but the Confederate Congress and the Confederate War Department rejected this measure. It is surprising because African Americans from New Orleans were volunteering to do so, but they were denied the right by the Confederate Congress and the Confederate War Department. They blatantly said that they do not want to taint this war by having those men participate in the war. Among those in the Confederate States who favored using African American soldiers were Richard Ewell, as well as the Alabama State Legislature. Alabama State Legislature came out in favor of arming slaves. But the first real substantial proposal came from Major General Patrick Claiborne in 1863. That a large number, and Claiborne proposed that a large number of slaves should be trained for military service and freed if they agreed to do so. No decision was made, but a heated debate did ensue, and Claiborne was never promoted again or given a significant command again. Everything came to a head regarding African American slaves or slave soldiers in the Confederate States. In 1864, Jefferson Davis proposed a very limited form of emancipation in the Confederate States, but encountered major opposition. This emancipation, arming them, all of this stuff went contrary to what these men had gone into. This was just unbelievable to the vast majority of the slavocrats. This was something that they could not abide by. Now, his opponents argued that they had already given up so much in terms of personal rights, being subject to conscription, direct taxes, and having their slaves impressed for wartime duties. In the end, the endorsement of Robert E. Lee proved crucial. Lee pressed the wartime necessities of the government and really sort of forced the Richmond government into agreeing to arm slaves. Now, Lee was crucial in this decision. Lee was asked multiple times, on multiple occasions, for his opinion, but he refused to give it. Lee believed in a very strict separation of the military and political spheres. When he did make it known that he was in favor of arming African American slaves, and not only arming them, but giving freedom to any slave who fought, it really sealed the fate on that. And on March 23rd, 1865, the Confederate Congress, the Confederate Congress authorized the Confederate War Department to call for the enlistment of slave soldiers. They refrained from following all of Lee's Lee's advice. They did not offer freedom to those men who went or who were sent there as volunteers. There was this mind-boggling image of integrated units drilling in Richmond, black and white, African American and European American, drilling in the streets of Richmond. Had the government evacuated the city, after Robert E. Lee had already surrendered, had the Union Army was approaching, had the United States was approaching the city of Richmond, there was this amazing sight of integrated units drilling in the streets. And that wraps up our oversight, our overview of the home front during the United States Civil War. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this. A lot of people don't really tend to believe that the soldiers were there, that they had soldiers who were willing to fight for the Confederacy. The degree to which these men actually wanted to be there isn't really known. Whether or not these men fully intended to fight for the Confederacy, whether or not the Confederate States would have given them freedom or tried to impose slavery back on these men, it's really unknown. No one really knows what would have happened. But hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know what your thoughts on this topic is, on this issue is. And as always, I am Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.